So I want to thank Ezekiel so much for setting the field and in this very unique opportunity. Well, I think, thank you, Noah. My microphone. For this really rare opportunity for us to explore the enactive perspective. And we're very fortunate that Hanne Jaegher, who's a philosopher of cognitive science, will be pushing this work in the direction of intersubjectivity. What is it to be engaged in a way that is based in the experience of participatory sense making? So Hanne, please.
Thank you so much, Washington. I'm going to share my screen 1 second.
Can someone unpin me? No, if you could.
You're probably, you might have pinned yourself, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I see on the screen.
I would like to see my own notes while I'm presenting, but I can't do that because Zoom goes to
maybe
full
in the
screen.
view on the upper.
Yeah.
If you share, let's see, John, you had some experience with this before, right?
Sorry about this.
Oh, John, maybe John's still.
You can do, sorry, Noah, if you want, Hanne, what you can do is you can do the advanced, when you say share screen, click on advanced.
Yes.
And then start your presentation in presenter view, and then just select the part of the screen that's the slide, and your notes and so on will be on, won't be visible to everyone. If you want to do that. So you can say advanced under share screen, and then say select a portion of screen. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, that works pretty well. So then you start your presentation in presenter view if you're going to use that.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Screen portion. No, I should first start the presentation.
Start it in presenter view, and then if you're on a Mac, press Command Tab to get back to Zoom.
I can't get it. I will open my slides on my notes on another computer.
And while the presenters are offering their work and views, we're not going to have the chat open, so we can just stay concentrated with the presenter. Thank you.
But we are leaving the Q&A open, so if you have Q&A that's specific for the questions, you can go ahead and put it there, and then the panelists will review those in between and incorporate them into the presentations.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry. Can you see my screen now?
Looks good.
It looks good, Hanne. Great to see you.
You too. All right, so yes, I actually want to follow on from Ezekiel's presentation in a certain way, talking about care and caring and how to do that in a particular context. And this is the context of social justice. Actually, I've been thinking about social justice in the context of Canadian research. I'm in Vancouver in Canada at the moment, and I'm thinking about EDI issues, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I believe in the US it's shortened as DEI. And in thinking about this question, working towards social justice, I thought of presenting something to you that starts from a motivation that I will give for my presentation in the question of why do we keep gathering, which I will do in a moment. I will set the scene for my presentation by thinking about why do we keep gathering and talking to each other to try to solve big and small issues that we care about in the world. And then from that, I will derive a need to do work both conceptually and experientially in order to make change in the world. It relates to the question that Amy asked, and also her remark that inaction is maybe also, in a way of life. And then I will present an experiment that I recently did here at the Peter Wall Institute at UBC, at the University of British Columbia in Canada, on the dynamics and the experience of social interactions, and how we might become more aware and sensitive to these dynamics in order to work in part towards achieving social justice. And so I'm wondering about this question, why do we keep gathering? So as I said, I've been thinking about social justice, the issue of social justice, and what we do is we keep, as humans, coming together and talking and speaking to each other and organizing and working together to make a change. But why is it impossible to just solve the problems once and for all? Why can't we just solve the issues and then we can all go home and be in peace? And the reason why I'm asking this question is to indicate some boundaries of the issues and therefore focus us in on where we can do useful work. If we were to be able to solve, and the indication of these boundaries is that if we were to be able to solve the problems and go home and be in peace, that wouldn't last. It would only last if we stopped acting, if we stopped moving, if we stopped becoming and transforming, two of the key concepts that Ezekiel also explained already. So it is in becoming, in this transforming, that we must search for how to change things. We cannot escape our continual becoming. And it's important to point this out because ongoing transforming and becoming are what everything turns around. And therefore, this ongoing becoming and transforming are what we need to understand well, should we be doing good action. So we need to understand very well this ontology of continually changing and becoming, which I think is indeed the enactive paradigm is doing this, and it is not what we are used to thinking of in a Western scientific paradigm. Another boundary that this question of why we keep gathering points us to, and why we can't just solve it all and go home and be in peace, indicates another boundary that this indicates is that we will only be able to go home and be in peace after having solved all the problems if we never again so much as look at each other, be aware of each other. Because as soon as we enter into the slightest contact with each other, the problems actually stop being solved. As soon as we look at each other, the limits of our tolerance, of our self-sufficiency, and of our peace become clear. In fact, the so-called peace is immediately shattered. As soon as anything gets in motion, there's also struggle. So as Ezekiel says, there is no harmony, or there might be harmony temporarily, but intrinsically, the world and living are restless things that we do. So this question of why we keep gathering, of why we keep talking with each other and solving the problems, indicates for us the boundaries of right action. In the following sense, we cannot expect to find solutions or fixity or in fixing things, that means making them static. We can't find it in rigidity, not in a static ontology, and we also can't find it in solipsism or in any kind of individualism, because we cannot not be in contact with each other. So we are talking about a continual becoming of everything and a continual participation of everything in everything. And those are the conditions of the world on which it keeps turning. And so here is where we need to work in order to make better action possible. And I think this question is actually really a question of how to live well together through this restlessness, with the restlessness. collaborating with it in a way, if you like, and making better tensions and better contradictions happen. So in relation to the work towards social justice, there are a lot of policies and guidelines and trainings and definitions of what is social justice, what is equity, and so on. And some of those turn around bringing in more diversity into organizations and so on, making sure that we have diverse groups of people and so on. And that's very good. It sets, of course, a totally basic context, a context that is of basic importance. But what isn't often looked at in detail is what actually happens in interactions between people. And I think this in interactions between people is a site where we can really do work as well. And so that is what we are doing with the enactive theory of intersubjectivity or participatory sense making, which is what I will introduce a little bit now. So enactive cognitive science, Ezekiel already introduced it a little bit. I'm sure Evan will also, in his presentation, do some more introduction to it. Started with the book The Embodied Mind in 1991 from Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche, and has made many developments since then. It's within this approach that also our work on participatory sense making that Ezekiel and I have been doing since 2007 or even before is situated. And participatory sense making is all about understanding people as sense makers, which is a basic element of the enactive approach, and also understanding social interactions as autonomous processes that take people up in particular ways to participate in each other's sense making. So here you can already see a basic tension in this approach, namely between people as sense makers, individuals who are sense makers, who self-organize, who are autonomous, to whom things matter, for whom things are at stake, and who are continually engaging in relational processes of signification, and who always have a certain perspective on the world on the basis of their particular embodiment, and which gives rise to needs and constraints for them. And enactive human cognizers are understood as self-organizing beings who relate to their world and are able to regulate their interactions with the world as well, and that makes them agents. I'm going through this fairly quickly because it's fairly basic, but what also is important is that sense making is a precarious process. We always are actually balancing on this or maintaining staying within boundaries of viability. You can see here a slide made by Ezekiel. So we self-maintain, and the circle here represents this self-maintenance and self-organization, but it's a precarious process, and we continually have to adapt and adjust ourselves and the world in order to keep this self-organization going. And because it is a precarious process, this is what makes things significant for sense makers, because they need certain things and need to avoid other things in order to keep existing. And this is where the significance comes in. And this is why we call them sense makers. It's an active notion, and it's based in our very deep embodiment in our senses and in our sensibilities. And this points us to elements in the world or interactions in the world that matter to us and that we have to engage carefully in. So a basic question in Enaction is always, why does something mean something for someone here? What is at stake for the person or the creature that we are studying? And we always have to connect behavior and self-organization on the enactive approach. And another important basic tension, which Ezekiel already brought into his presentation as well, is that between self-production and self-distinction. And I'm borrowing a slide from Ezekiel again. As Ezekiel explained, agency comes out of this tension which has to keep being maintained between producing yourself and also distinguishing yourself from the world from which and in which you are producing yourself. You can never do either of these things alone. You always have to also do the other, and in a way keep balancing between them. These are some basic tensions of individual sense makers, also when they engage in interactions. So the other basic pillar of the idea of participatory sense making is that interaction processes can take on a life of their own, interactions as processes emerge between people, they are dynamic and emergent, and they can influence us and take us up in certain ways. And they regulate themselves in interaction with our self-organization as individual agents. We gave a definition of this. It's not so important right now, this definition precisely, but the point is that we literally participate in each other's sense-making out of this primordial tension between our own self-organization and the interactive order, if you like, as Kaufman also called it, that we engage with. And these are themselves dynamical processes, existential processes of self-organization, interacting with the world, regulating these interactions, and contending with an interactive process that is itself also precarious. So we extended these ideas into the realm of language by speaking about how we are all different bodies, we regulate at different levels, as linguistic bodies, as sensory motor bodies, and as languaging creatures, we move in a living stream of language. We participate in weaving threads of meaning with each other. We incorporate and incarnate ways of speaking and so on. And we are always fully participating. Everybody is always fully participating. Sometimes in relation to social justice, people are excluded because they don't speak in ways that are so recognizable to people who speak in dominant ways. But everybody is participating as they are. This is important to realize, actually. And so an ethical maxim that follows from the enactive approach is to always invite and support participation, but even more perhaps to see participation as it is from all people who are present in interactions. And so we think this is moving towards an engaging epistemology, so a way of knowing that is built in interaction, that builds interactions in which we move and transform each other continually, and that also engages us back. So knowers or scientists or therapists are changed by what they're knowing, what they are doing, by their practices. And so in another paper, which I won't say too much about, I've proposed that this is similar to our experience of loving dynamics or of the existential dialectical tension that I think is very basic to loving, which is the tension between being and being in relation. So we are continually being ourselves and letting each other be and being let be by others. And this is ongoingly and unavoidably full of paradoxes, uncertainties, inconsistencies, and ambiguity, and contradictions and tensions, like Ezekiel already mentioned as well. And we must hold these tensions. We will solve them momentarily, perhaps, but they always give rise to new tensions. And so we ongoingly move as these tensionful beings. And we move between over and under determining others and also being over and under determined. So if you have too much of a theoretical idea of how we should treat each other, we may over determine each other and thereby stop the flow of creative interactions, imaginative engagements that we may have with each other. So these are very briefly some theoretical beginnings of the approach to participatory sense-making and how we engage in interaction. Now what I would like to do is to speak about an experiment or a workshop that I've been doing that is a particular research method within the enactive approach, or adjacent to or affiliated to the enactive approach. It's called PRISMA, and it's a research method for systematically unfolding the experience of interacting. So what happens is, PRISMA is not an acronym, although it could be standing for participating and researching in sense-making activities or something like that, as my colleague Rika Preiser put it, with whom I did this experiment a few weeks ago. But PRISMA refers to a prism, which comes from the image of a prism, which refracts light into its constituent colors. And this methodology refracts experience, interactive experience, into its constituent aspects, so that we can see them, these constituent phenomenological experiential aspects, and thereby understand better what these dynamics are as we participate in interactions. So it's an approach that is fully embodied, and it's is also fully intersubjective in both its concepts and its methodology, because it brings in researchers as participants, and participants become researchers even if they are not academics. Anybody who participates becomes the researcher of their own experience on the occasion of a workshop or experiment in Prisma. And researchers are the very fine-tuned instrument of the investigation here, as a living human sense maker to whom things matter, and who brings their whole body and their whole context to these kinds of investigations. So Prisma uses or has people go through first-person approximations of interactions. I will explain in a moment in some more detail and concretely what that means. They also go through second-person engagements with each other in these live interactions. And what is basic to Prisma is that people take different modes of relating to what is going on. So we give them a protocol by which they focus one by one on engaging in an interaction from a thinking modality, from a sensing modality, and from a feeling modality, which is one of these ways in which we refract interactive experience. And they also do it through different references of perception. So they sometimes focus on themselves and sometimes on the other person in a systematic course of engaging. And what is also very important is that Prisma, or participants in Prisma, explicitly observe the in-between or the interaction as well in these experiments. So in April, we did an experiment here at the Peter Wall Institute, which we called Interacting Across Difference. It was meant to look at how we interact in these situations where there is high difference between people, for instance, people from different ages or different backgrounds of any kind. And we had three goals, or Prisma experiments always have three goals, which is to refract these concrete interactive experiences, so to look at them in detail, but also to unearth tendencies in interactive dynamics, so to do research on what these interactive dynamics are, and make findings on them in order to complement or to refine the theory of participatory sense making, but also to test it, to test whether these tensions that we speak about in the theory between self-organization of participants and interactive dynamics, whether these actually happen and how they happen. So it's also a research method for participatory sense making. And at the same time, it provides training for participants to become aware of these interactive dynamics. So anybody who participates can expect to become more sensitive to these interactive dynamics and will come out of a Prisma workshop changed in a way. Maybe minimally, maybe a lot, it depends on each person. And as I said, I did this work together with Rika Preiser, who is also currently a Wall Scholar and is professor at Stellenbosch University, and she's a philosopher and a complexity scientist. So here you see an interaction. What we did was we invited people to draw together, and we gave them so people repeatedly stepped into these interactions, which is drawing together on a sheet of paper. And as you can see, there is also an observer sitting here, and these are two people interacting. And we let them take perspectives on their interaction in a systematic order, and the observer observes what happens in between them on the basis of specific prompts that we give people. And the drawing, each drawing or an interaction is 1 minute long, and we invite people to start by touching pen tips in the middle of the paper. I will show it again. You can see the beginning here. They start by putting their pen tips in the middle of the paper together. That's like a greeting, if you like. And then we say, go, they start, they move together for 1 minute. And when I say stop, when the minute is over, we ask them to move again to the middle, touch pen tips in a way of greeting in a way, and then the interaction is finished. And that's what they will be analyzing. And they do this several times throughout the course of a workshop. And the instruction is to not take the pen off the paper, so to be continually drawing and to not speak. So it's really to focus in on a very short interaction process, which we invite in a kind of container form between this greeting of touching pen tips at the beginning and at the end. Here's another illustration. What I like about this video is that it's not so much, you can see here clearly, it's not so much about the drawing as such, although that's also interesting. But really what we're inviting people to do is to interact with each other in this way. And it gives a container for that. So it's really moving together in a focused, small container of interacting that we invite. There is the end, they touched pen tips, and then that's the end of the interaction. So then what we do is that, as I said, in each interaction, there are 2 people participating and 1 observer. And immediately after each interaction, each of the participants, both interactors and observer, make notations of their experience based on specific prompts that we give them. And in these prompts, we ask them, for instance, to focus on sensing, and on their self-perception. And then they do another interaction and they will do again sensing, but then focusing on other perception while drawing again. So when all the participants do this, we had 10 participants in groups of 3, we get something like 27 sets of drawings and notations, which is an enormous amount of data overall, but also each of these individual interactions plus the notations for this particular interaction come together on what we call a matrix. So people make these notations on post-its and then put them together in an ordered way. So we see here a green post-it notes from this interactor, which gets put here. This color means that it was interactor B doing self-perception. So they have been, in the first round, they do self-perception here, and in the second round of drawing they do other perception, and so all the notations get put together in this way in which we can trace where each notation was made and what prompt it came from. And so now we can look in a little more detail at what goes on, and the process of, I call it analysis, but I don't actually think if it's the right word yet. We're still thinking continually about which words to use for which parts of the process. Analysis is maybe not ideal. But after people put all their notations together on the matrix in this ordered way, and here's self-perception, there's other perception, then the next step in their intersubjective process of looking at this data is that they read their notations to each other so that they familiarize themselves with what each other has said. So for instance, in the first round here, interactor A said, I sensed flow and perceived resonance as their self-perception of the interaction while they were drawing. And interactor B here said that they sensed the texture of the paper and my pen moving evenly across the paper, and so on. And then the observer sensed things like divide, reflection, white, untangled. This is their perception of the interaction as it's happening, as they are watching it. And in the second part, they do other perception. So they engage in the drawing again, and now they, I forgot what the prompt is exactly, but while engaging in the interaction, I put myself into the shoes of the other person and I sensed in myself. And then the response here was movement, it seemed to me that in terms of sensing, so the other person sensed movement, empathy, and openness. And here interactor A, so here's interactor B sensing what interactor A was sensing. They have a playful, curious energy. She seems to be exploring. She seems to sense energy and flow. So this is how all these interactions are approached by them. And then the group of 3 people, the interactors and the observer, try to find similarities in what they have noted down, which they then, this is the next step of the interaction. Here you see number 2, they read each other's approximations, they note some similarities. Here, the similarities that they noted were sense flow and reflection. And once they found that, the next step in the process is to configure the process, which means that interactors produce on purpose in themselves this sensed quality. Here they chose to produce reflection. So then they do the interaction again, they engage with each other again in the drawing, producing this sense of reflection. And then comes the final step of the interaction, of the investigation, which is that they refine or reword the similarity that they previously found in a new way that gives more detail or refines or reformulates what they have experienced. And in this case, the outcome of that was, which they do together now, they said, accompaniment includes and allows reflection, deflection, and distortion. So this happening of the sense of reflection was refined in accompanying that allows for reflection, deflection, and distortion. And now you must be curious what the drawings were that they did. So the first drawing they made together looked like this. So here is interactor A's drawing, I think, and this is interactor B. So they're sitting one here, and the observer next to them here, watching it. For other perception, they did the interaction again and focused on what the other person might be sensing. And this was their drawing. And then after finding the similarity of reflection and refining it, they drew this. And here they said accompaniment includes or allows reflection, deflection, and distortion. So the drawings have changed quite a bit. They've gone through a process here. We think that by reflection, they don't so much mean thinking as reflection, almost in a sense of mirroring each other, and maybe distorting what they each did on their own before. So this is just one interaction run through that one group did in one of the rounds that we did. We did many of these rounds. We're actually still analyzing and looking at the data. This is just to show you the process of looking through it. This is only one small number of interactions there. We're still busy looking at the data and seeing what we can say. But some findings and reflections now, yes, in the sense of thinking about this, the most general result, in a sense, we could say is that difference makes a difference, like Bateson already said, but it does so in concrete, unexpected, and particular ways. So you can trace what individual people have thought and done and sensed during an interaction about themselves, about the other, and the observer about what they notice of the in-between. And then we track this live trajectory through this unfolding interactive situation, and we can find trends or tendencies in line with participatory sense-making theory. For instance, this primordial tension between autonomies at work and self-maintenance of interactors and historicity. What we also think is that the Prisma workshop as a whole, this is a 2-day workshop where people engage in these interactions one by one, many of them in a systematic way. So this whole Prisma workshop, to which we invite people, is a container to experiment and play with interaction dynamics. And within that, the specific rounds of drawing each time for 1 minute are also a container for a refined interaction, which we variously analyze and trace. And in some sense, maybe it seems safe or meaningless, these little interactions. They're playful and small and involve color and drawing. But it is in these interactions that people can gain sensitivities to dynamics, contradictions, ambiguities, and so on, which come out always in interactions that we have with each other. But here, people have an opportunity to play with them and to live through them and to become aware of their own dynamics. So one thing that we found, for instance, is some people who get to be aware of that they always take the lead in an interaction, and how that happens precisely. They get an insight into how they tend to take the lead in an interaction or dominate an interaction, which is interesting because once you become aware of it, that gives you the chance to begin changing it. I don't think change can happen without a very basic awareness of what actually goes on. And this is, I think, what this methodology does in part, or provides. And so some reactions from participants after the workshop, one of them mentioned that they found meaning again in their neuroscience work, and could connect again to how she was investigating something that people care about and how she can better research it. Yeah, maybe I'll leave the other ones for now because I think I actually don't know until when I have it. I think I might need to move on a little bit. I'm looking at Roshi Joan to see if she says yes or no.
No, a little more. You're
more.
good. Yeah.
A few more minutes. Okay.
Yes.
So just some reflections from this initial analysis or that we've been doing, just to bring it back to the question of social justice. Why do we keep gathering? I said we need to, and we need to take it seriously because we're ongoing becoming and transforming. So we cannot but gather again, meet again, interact again. So we need to do this work also in these interactions. We need to set the stage by quota for diversity and so on, but we also need to do the work in the interactions. And I've explained that we can do that both conceptually by getting a very clear grip on the phenomena of participatory sense making through the concepts we've been developing over the last years. But we also can do this on the level of the interaction, in the interaction with this, and Prisma is one method that does this, not the only one, and it also doesn't do everything, far from it, but what it does is it brings people together as bodily beings. It gives them a hands-on chance to engage in these individual interactive processes. It gives a container to them for gaining awareness and sensitivity, for increasing their capacity to deal with different dynamics and interaction on the basis of their own lived experience. And one aspect that I didn't explain yet is that integral to the Prisma workshops is that we tune or calibrate people bodily by bodily exercises to become sensitive to what they will be doing during the workshop, which is something I can say more about, but this is integral also to the work. So it's important to understand that practice and theory in the enactive approach and also in Prisma, which actually comes from Feldenkrais practice from Barbara Pieper and Daniel Clina, practice and theory go hand in hand. We cannot have one without the other. And maybe as Amy said, it's also, this relates to being a way of living, but a way of living, we need to be reflective and we need to be doing. So there also we have practice and theory both. And in relation to social justice, it's not just about bringing in diversity, but it's about increasing sensitivity and our skill in, through, and of interactive dynamics. And this happens between people who are all different from each other. So it's not about just bringing in the different people. No, the people who are often in the dominant groups are actually also different from everybody else. And things matter to everybody who participates. So in a way, I would say we shouldn't stay out of interactions and we shouldn't be afraid of engaging in them. We should learn better to live in and through interactions, in and with the contradictions and the tensions. But we need, as Ezekiel just said, better, more fertile contradictions and tensions. So we need to fight for social justice and against social injustice. And some things need to be stopped, like racism, sexism, and so on, clearly need to be stopped. We ideally would not be engaging in racist interactions anymore. But what it requires, I think, is opening the fixity or the rigidity that often that racist interactions are, because they overdetermine an other by just othering them, and this forecloses engagement. So we need to open engagement, and I think Prisma and participatory sense making are theoretical and practical ways that can begin to pull open this rigidity and increase our sensitivity and our capacity for becoming, transforming, and participating.
Oh, Hanne, thank you so much. And I really appreciate so much this being, applied kind of in the context of our lived experience, somatically, affectively, and cognitively. And both as, an experiment in revealing our connectedness. Al, I'd love for you to reflect, and then let's take questions first from our faculty and then our wonderful community, extended community.
Thanks so much, Roshi, and thank you, Hanne. Wonderful presentation and so well integrated with what Ezekiel had to say. One of the things I'm struck with is how your Prisma experiment or workshop really enacts the dialectic that you referred us to concerning the tension between self-production and self-differentiation that Ezekiel first alerted us to in his talk. I'm also struck by how many of our participants who have been putting something in the Q&A box have been taken with this idea of crisis of care. And so I wonder if, Hanne, you and perhaps also Ezekiel might want to expand a little bit on how this way of enacting, making explicit such dialectic has some capacity for addressing our habits of not seeing, for this narrowing of focus in our sense of caring.
Yes, that was an excellent question. Thank you for bringing that back up. Yes, I do think that this narrowing of sense making is problematic, and what we, I think, need to do, or what one of the things that can work, is to invite people into interactions where, for instance, things start to matter to them too. So one of the problems, I think, is that dominant groups in society, when they want to make change, say, okay, bring in the people who are not used to being dominant and put all the onus on them to make change. That's the overwhelming approach, I have the impression. But this doesn't change the people in the dominant groups. And it doesn't need to change for them because they are used to being dominant and everything's fine. But we have to start to make it matter to them. And I think that happens mainly in interactions with each other. There's a lot of research that shows that people become less racist the more experience they have with each other, with people with different skin color. So, and it is those interactions that we need to invite more of, so that it starts to matter also to the people who are or were used to being dominant or come from dominant groups. And if that happens more, I don't know actually how to bring that about, but if we have EDI measures or equity, diversity, and inclusion measures that bring more people together, then we also need to work on the interactive processes between them to refine those and to pull them open so that people can widen their possibilities again for interacting with each other. And I think that's where part of the work needs to be done.
Thank you. Ezekiel, do you want to say anything in addition to that?
No, not much. I agree with what Hanne has said. I think because I have been participant in one of these workshops before, or at least a couple of times, and I can give you sort of a my personal experience of how you don't think you have preconceptions, even somebody who really thinks through, okay, you know, I will be open-minded about things and so on, and it's amazing how these experiences show you that you do have preconceptions. Most of the time you do. You just don't you accept them as normal, as they're there, and there's no problem with them, or you don't even recognize them. And this sort of methodology, sometimes through the interactions, that's the key element. Through the interaction, you realize, oh, I was thinking about this in a particular way, but now I realize another person in front of me is thinking about it in a totally different way. It never occurred to me. So it is a good exercise in training something that we do not often train ourselves, our capacity to not just be empathetic, but also be a good participant, be able to connect. And I think that in that sense, it could be a good methodology and might contribute to this idea of stop having a narrow sense making and being able to know how to widen it, what methods can help us do this.
Thank you so much. You know, I noticed in also in some of the Q&A box contributions, an interest in, Hanne, how you got participants to connect with their body at the start of the interaction. And so I'm curious about how you think about the embodiment aspect of what you're doing. And I'd also be curious about some of Evan's reflections on this, since he has been quite interested in this question.
Yeah, so what we do, the Prisma methodology was actually developed by two people, Barbara Pieper and Daniel Klina, who work in Feldenkrais practice, which is a movement practice that works on awareness through movement and functional integration of the body when people have, for instance, an accident and they have shoulder pain. Feldenkrais works on the whole body and on the person's sense of integrity and awareness through their own movement, to bring the body back together and make it work as a whole. And so that's where Prisma came from. Barbara and Daniel developed it as a methodology for practitioners of Feldenkrais to become aware of their own practice. And so the way that we prepare people bodily to do the investigations in the workshops is by, Barbara usually does it by simple Feldenkrais exercises that let people move, focus on their movement, and become aware of small ways to discern influence of one movement on another movement, or discern how a movement is different when they do it in this way or that way. So it's really about bringing people into bodily exercises that allow them to make fine discernments between different ways of moving, sensing this, feeling this, thinking about it, and how that changes how they move next. So we do these kinds of exercises with people, specifically geared to which part of the investigation people will be doing. Yeah, so it's
Thank you.
Actual bodily preparation or tuning of participants.
That's very helpful. Evan, anything you'd like to contribute on this?
That was a very interesting presentation and very rich morning with both Hanne and Ezekiel. And I haven't experienced the Prisma method or practice, so I can't really speak about it from that experiential perspective. But I'm interested in doing so now, especially that I've seen a presentation about it. And Hanne and I have had a little chance to talk about this, but I haven't really had a chance to explore it in depth. I suppose a question that comes to mind for me, though, in a way, this is related to something that Richie said earlier, is that it seems to me that to enter into the space of doing something like Prisma, you already are likely to be open and receptive to that way of working with other people, or of, you know, maybe setting aspects of yourself to the side in order to be receptive to something that comes up in a context like that. But in the EDI context, of course, that's not necessarily the type of person that you're always going to be dealing with. So it raises the question again of how we think about what we're willing to explore and what we're doing in this conversation and in other practices, and how it relates to the wider world. And it's not as if I have an answer to this question, but it causes me in a way to raise it again. And so I'm interested in how you think about the practice, maybe in relation to that larger and more difficult world.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't really have an answer to it either, except that I think practices like these, and also, for instance, dialogue, different kinds of dialogue practices, need to work in a kind of guerrilla way, maybe by being practiced more and more and more, and sort of seeping into society, making differences where they can locally. And this might make people interested or curious and bring them in. So that's a very, very slow, small scale work to do that, which is what I can see from these kinds of practices. But how to bring it really to more widely to bring in people who aren't used to or already interested in thinking about, that's a really difficult question. But I mean, people also make, so EDI policies often involve trainings that people are obliged to take. This could be provided as one such training, I imagine, which works on a different level than trainings that are often provided about recognizing, or using the right language, which is important. Those kinds of things are important. And next to that, Prisma could maybe be provided as a training. And it might have to be adjusted for that, towards opening people up towards it more than it is now, because now it kind of indeed presupposes that people are already open to this kind of approach.
Thank you, Hanne. I noticed that there are several participants who are raising a question about how culture may contribute to the crisis of care, whether constraining in some way our habits of seeing, or in possibly other ways. So I'm wondering, Hanne, whether you have any observations from your Prisma experiment relevant to cultural differences in how people approach this. And also perhaps, Ezekiel, how you see culture as contributing to our habits of not seeing.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize. And I know we only have a couple of minutes left to
culture is
that.
such a big thing and can be understood in such different ways. I mean, there's the obvious Western scientific culture that Ezekiel already mentioned as well, of boxing things up, divisionary, and so this is in a way countercultural to that. That's one small thing I can say about it, but it's such a big question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I know Evan will touch a bit on culture in his presentation later.
If I might say something short, is that from an enactive perspective, that this distinction between culture and, I don't know, biology is problematic, because we are ongoingly incorporating culture into our habits, into our views, into our visual perception. The studies that show that people from different cultures tend to focus on different parts of a picture. So that there is no clear-cut distinction there. So this is a big point that they had to be careful how to formulate that question, which I'm sure can be just reformulated in order to then, in this idiom of an active perspective too. But we are, when we talk about crisis of care, it's our culture. It is our culture. But interestingly, to understand that is also to understand why non-enactive perspectives on human beings are so prevalent and so persistent, because in some way, they have spread through the culture, and they are, you don't see them only on scientific articles or academic journals or books. You see it in movies, you see it in people interacting, you see it when people are having a chat at the pub and the coffee. So that is how we enact a way of looking at ourselves that is not quite what the enactive approach would suggest is the right way. So that's how the culture creates its own loops of persistence. And these are the things that we might need to criticize.
Very helpful. Thank you. Before we have our slightly longer break between the morning and the afternoon, Roshi, back to you for anything you'd like to contribute.
I want to thank you both so much for setting the field in the way that you have, with many questions coming up for me. I'm looking forward to this afternoon. We'll begin at 2:00 Mountain Time. John Dunn is going to offer a brief meditation, and then Evan will be looking at Enaction, and he says looking back and looking forward. So and Evan shared his material with us. I think it's really important, again, deepening the field. Followed by Amy reflecting on Evan's perspective, and then Richie Davidson will be leading the afternoon session, the last session of this afternoon, with Al reflecting. And I encourage us to take time off the screen, and also to, if you can, step into the so-called outside world, so that you can really refresh your body, your heart, and mind. And thank you so much, Ezekiel and Hanne, for this very rich morning, and Amy and Al, deep, deep appreciation.